Evening, everyone. Tuesday evening for the Dan and Omar show. Another night of Champions League action, which quite looking forward to. Chelsea Atletico tonight. I always seem to enjoy Atletico in the Champions League. There's like an extra buzz about the types of games that I've really enjoyed for the last 5-6 years. We're not going to be chatting Champions League tonight, though. We're going to be chatting around the topic, I guess, of sporting integrity, which collides our worlds quite nicely. But Dan, do you want to talk about what we're talking about this tonight, but also a couple of other things you wanted to address?
Of course. So first thing is, if I remember, Omar, from last week, we did our predictions at the end, but it was Champions League week yesterday, last midweek, and I think if I remember correctly, I backed PSG and Liverpool, and you put back Barca and Leipzig. I just want to double check that is correct.
That is correct, but I'd like to point out that I only did that just to make it interesting, so we can have this kind of light banter to start the show. That's that was the main reason for it.
Well, so very kind. Yes. So just a couple of things. One of the things is, as you know, and I know you're a very charitable guy as well, is I'm on the board of a really good charity called Football Aid, as people know. Like a lot of companies, lots of charities at the moment, they're going through pretty tough times in terms of lack of events, and obviously everything closing down to the extent it has in the UK and around the world. So what we are doing as Football Aid is trying to get together a campaign, which is a text to donate competition, or not a competition, but a text to win campaign. And all you need to do is text footy, which is FOOTY, to 785. And all of the proceeds are going to go to Football Aid and the charity, which, among other things, provides for lots of monies and resources for diabetes charities. So again, it's footy to 785. I'm going to be doing this a few times over the next month or so. So apologies if I'm going to sound a bit repetitive, but it's for a great cause, and hopefully everyone or some will be able to spare some money for them. So that's great. And on to tonight's show. So yeah, I messaged you, obviously, I think it was yesterday or today, about thinking about a couple of interlinked subjects. The first being the reports, I think it was after the weekend, and then in the David Ornstein column in The Athletic yesterday, which really piqued my attention around the Jack Grealish injury, and that's sort of what got us going, I guess, for the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah. So for those who missed the story, Jack Grealish missed the game against Leicester on the weekend, which was Villa lost. But it emerged before the game that Leicester knew about it, that the team news was leaked, and obviously Grealish being an important player for Villa is a fairly important piece of team news that the opposition would love to know before the game, because you can adapt your plans accordingly. And it emerged. Now there's several potential sources for the leak. There were rumours before the game, regardless, and apparently training ground photos as well, I think. But one of the potential culprits was members associated with Aston Villa changing their fantasy league team. And it's kind of a fun story in of itself, the idea that has an impact on real life football. But there are potential sporting integrity issues which we can dig into. But firstly, on this Villa one, how did it emerge, and are there kind of issues surrounding the topic?
Well, yeah, I think when we talk about sort of integrity of competition issues, more, I think, as we've talked about in the past, we think about betting and insider information, and somewhat the intentional provision of insider information for some type of gain, I guess, is ultimately the point. And we've talked about that in terms of Kieran Trippier's FA ban and associated types of behaviours. And I hadn't really thought about, some hadn't really thought about this too much. If I give you a brief example where the context came from, is that quite a good few years ago now, we talked about it before, as someone that works with a lot of footballers and agents, and someone that was thinking about doing fantasy football, as soon as I realised I probably had a bit more information than the average punter, I was always very cautious of the perception of doing fantasy football, in part because I may or may not put my clients or players in that I like or don't like, or however else it might be, but also in case then there would be the direct or indirect presumption or perception that somehow I would use that information which wasn't in the public domain to benefit my team. And in a way, and that's why I didn't really do, I mean, might sound a bit pedantic, but ideally it was just to make sure that that couldn't be thrown at me as the truth. Yeah. And we're in the situation now where it looks like that there are different types of automated software bots that can identify private fantasy football leagues populated by players that have teams. And so I guess as soon as you can identify those teams and leagues to a degree, and they're not, I guess, private in the sense that then it can't be found, then I guess those bots are scraping that information as to when transfers in or transfers out are happening. I guess in the same way it could be, even though it's less likely for transfers because those players might not know what's going on. But in this instance, and it's in a piece that myself and one of my colleagues, Alex Harvey, has written today, that's on LinkedIn, I'll post afterwards, was that 5 people linked to Aston Villa had, in the days preceding the game, transferred out Jack Grealish out of their fantasy team. Now, obviously, they weren't doing it with the intention to create a disadvantage or a competitive disadvantage for their team. They could probably think of nothing else that they'd want to do for Villa. But at the same time, this type of indirect, non-intentional activity that they wouldn't think would have necessarily have occurred as a result has happened. So we saw it apparently Matt Targett, Neil Taylor, Conor Hourihane, who's at Swansea, the first team performance analyst, and actually the physio transferred out Grealish. Now, once that came to light yesterday, I believe, or so, Villa have quite quickly come out and said, we're just simply stopping players from doing this, and we're going to ban them from being able to play in fantasy football, full stop. The query is whether that goes on a level and other teams do the same, or whether actually now, there's a halfway house. I don't think that the halfway house seems very difficult, is the truth, doesn't it? Because it's almost like, okay, you can still keep playing, but you need to be very careful about transferring in or out any of your own players. Or is there a rule, like, for example, you can play it, but you can't pick any of your own players that you know in your team to be able to do things? But as we talked, then you got
before, opposition players. So we've got a certain team we're playing this week. To be sub in or out players of that team, and then in effect you're talking about all 20 teams in the league.
Well, it just leads to really quite odd situations, doesn't it? Where you could have a situation like, again, we talked about in the prep for this beforehand, where, and I know maybe some people are thinking this is pedantic, but it's all to do with incentives and misaligned incentives or otherwise, where, let's just say you're a Newcastle defender playing against Spurs in the next couple of weeks, and you know that your back line might be stretched for a particular reason because there's a few injuries and things that people don't know about. And you decide to triple captain Harry Kane, for example. Now, it just not only, I think the point is it's not a good look, I think, is the point, firstly. But I think secondly, it just blurs the lines between perception and reality. Is that everybody obviously wants to play fantasy football, but at the same time, the priority for all these players and for the managers and backroom staff isn't for everyone to get caught up in who's going to get an assist or a clean sheet or triple points or which subs to bring in or out. It's to do your day job, and some of those things can get a little bit tricky at times.
Yeah, it's a funny one because on the one hand, we want our players to kind of be human, right? We want them to enjoy the same things that we enjoy. I think I kind of like the idea of so take your example there of I don't know, someone triple captaining a player. So if you're a Spurs player, for example, you triple captaining a player who's playing against Arsenal just because you want them to be Arsenal. And I think that's the kind of thing that actually fans love, even as much as kind of like a last ditch tackle or whatever. It's the kind of thing that brings the players closer to the fans. And you've got to be careful, about the kind of balance you strike. And it's almost a shame that, I don't know. I'm almost a bit. I don't like the idea of bots kind of scraping this data and trying to give people. I mean, people take it very seriously. I think there's about 7 million fantasy football players. Magnus Carlsen, I think, was the winner one year. There's probably a lot of money at stake within individual leagues. So I get why that's the case, but I also feel a bit. It's a shame that we have to kind of rob the players with a little bit of fun on the side. That I don't think in practice has integrity issues. As you said, it's the perception of the integrity issues that I think is the main challenge.
And it's also like, for example, if you're the Arsenal captain in real life, for example, would Arsenal fans be happy if you had 3 Spurs players in your fantasy team, for example, in the same way as we saw today? And I'm not sure whether it's right or not, but I saw it on Twitter, which obviously must be wrong. But I saw that it was reported that, and this is how odd things are getting now, is that it was reported that there's controversy because Bobby Firmino has liked a Instagram post of Richarlison scoring in the derby. Okay. And so there's now this outrage that how outrageous is it that a Liverpool player should like a post from their arch rival of scoring a goal, even though obviously they're Brazilian teammates and obviously are friends and the rest of that type of stuff. So it's almost like that sort of in one sense, odd asymmetry mixed with this, like, should you be doing it for integrity perspective, but also should you be doing it because you shouldn't like the rival team or suggest things to happen in a certain way?
Yeah, absolutely. So you get into these kind of like maze of options that they can have. Jaime's asking a question: wouldn't this be over if the players themselves, team staff did not reveal their IDs in their Fantasy Premier League app? I suppose so, but I suppose a lot of these people play in quite big leagues, so as soon as it comes out that one player, I don't know, MT184 is actually Matt Target, Villa left back, I think is you just kind of the issue emerges again. We were going to use it, unless there was anything else particular to say on that topic, we were going to use this as a bit of a segue into the depths that clubs will go to in order to prepare for the next game, which is absolutely fair enough, because particularly for teams, that Leicester are pushing for Champions League football, the impact of 1 point for Leicester this year, particularly this year where it's incredibly tight between Leicester, Liverpool, Chelsea, and I suppose to a lesser degree Man United. 1 point can make a difference. Knowing whether Grealish is playing or not can make a big difference. So clubs are now increasingly sophisticated about the way that they do analysis and so on. And we can get into, I can provide a bit more background as to how clubs are set up now behind the scenes. But if we go to the far extreme, the Spygate issue with Bielsa, was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, I think, with Derby County. Firstly, remind us again what the wrongdoing was there, what the fines were, but also, I guess it provides a bit of an insight into the depths that clubs will go to.
Yeah, the long and short of it was that there was a bit of controversy after someone in the Derby training ground spotted an unidentified person looking at and taking notes of one of their training sessions. It turns out after some investigation that it was a Leeds employee that Bielsa had asked to look and take note of training, formation, tactics, the particular patterns of play that Derby were going to be undertaking for the next game against Leeds. And after the controversy of sorts, the EFL, because Leeds were in the Championship at the time, decided to charge the club for not behaving towards the member clubs with the utmost good faith. They were fined. The club was fined, even though Bielsa said that it was totally his responsibility. The club was ultimately fined £200,000 and warned about its future conduct. And then we got into the situation where we talked about before as well, Omar, of that relatively or pretty legendary press conference that happened as a result. And I guess the depths, the unknown depths to a lot of people that teams will go when scouting opposition.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I remember that press conference, and a lot of people who work within the analytics and analysis space in football are like, well, that's pretty normal, the kind of dossier on opponents and so on. But I think it really captured the imagination of a lot of people who didn't necessarily appreciate, you know, the amount of detail that clubs go into when analysing their opposition. And this can be kind of dated way back. So it's quite interesting, the story of Prozone, who were one of the pioneers in providing data and analysis to football clubs since the late 90s. And the story, as I understand it, goes that the inventors of Prozone, they hadn't invented Prozone yet, but they were trying to sell like a recovery massage chair to Steve McLaren. And McLaren was sitting in the chair, kind of checking it out, and he was watching some videos of the games, and he was saying, wouldn't it be great if I could clip together, you know, those key actions and moments in the games? And so the guy selling the chairs thought, well, that's a good idea. Let's try and do that. And so they set up Prozone, which was all around tagging events in a football match, assigning essentially data points to those football matches so you could draw the video quickly, but then also do analysis on the data. And so Prozone through the late 90s and then all the way through the noughties, you know, grew into this big performance analysis company that really pioneered the way in providing data and analysis for football clubs, essentially enabling, creating a whole new industry around pre-match preparation and eventually recruitment as well, to the extent that Prozone employed their own analysts and then seconded them out to clubs because clubs didn't really know what to do. They knew that they needed these analysts coming in, but they didn't really know what to do. And so Prozone would know the market a lot more, hire, you know, often sports science students and students out of university, and place them within clubs. And a lot of the kind of leaders in this space, including our CEO, was an analyst at one point working at a club. And so that grew and grew and grew, and the sophistication with which these departments have grown has really grown off the back of that, certainly within the UK. So initially you would start with a performance analyst who would essentially do everything. So pre-match preparation, looking at opposition set pieces, looking at key players, looking at video and data and so on. Post-match analysts, you know, eventually came along to review performance. Then you had the whole growth of sports science. You had the whole growth of recruitment departments, technical recruitment departments beyond just scouting. You know, nutritionists, training ground analysts, you know, dietary expert. You know, the whole works. And you know, everything about a footballer is now tracked, and everything about opposition footballers, which is kind of the stimulus for this discussion, is monitored as well. Clubs try and capture every single detail they can on opposition players. They do, you know, obviously pre-match scouting reports. The amount of depth that goes into kind of set piece analysis, and it's funny because you see on Match of the Day and you see on the highlights, you know, you'd be really disappointed to concede a goal from a set piece, and they actually are, because the amount of preparation that goes into analysing those set pieces, which probably explains why maybe only 4% of corners are scored, because actually, you know, they are you know, studied to kind of a kind of a deep degree now. But yeah, there's just so much detail now that exists within departments. I think the amount of roles that exist, I think a lot of people may not realise that, and it's why I suppose the information like the Jack Grealish information coming out is so important, because yes, you're doing all the analysis, but the moment you know Grealish isn't playing, then you have to adapt your game plan. You have an army of people who can kind of understand that from there.
One other bit that I was thinking about, Omar, as well, is, you know, obviously because a lot of your work is very much in that performance and data side of things, and obviously 21st Club do a whole array of those types of services and consultancy work, is how much of that information gets actually filtered down to the players pre-game, post-game, as continual development, and you always hear the stories. Some players feel that they're overloaded with information. Others want to soak it up. Sometimes, it stops at the manager and the sort of technical team, and not that much is filtered down. Some have a better relationship with data and analysis and, opposition analysis than others. In your experience, and then it's also the vehicle for how that information is provided. Is it big presentations involving the whole squad? Is it individualized, tailored iPads with 6 clips of this is the striker that you're probably going to be up against, etc.? In your experience, is it obviously a collection of all of those things together, or is it a top down, or is it now a much more bottom up approach where a lot of players will obviously want to have that info as well?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I mean, to be honest, I've not been that close to that space for a number of years now. But I think the kind of key point on not overloading players, I think, is probably the number one principle that clubs stick behind. I think they probably veer more on that side than the overloading. And then they, in speaking to analysts in the past, I think that there are certain players who are very receptive to it. I know in the past, chatting with one club before, I remember they had a few American players who were very open to coming into the analyst room and understanding their numbers, which is obviously a kind of cultural thing that the American players were more familiar with. But I think generally it's very much focused on kind of visual information, so videos and clips and so on, as opposed to tables and graphs. Just because, I think even at a personal level, if I'm watching, Monday Night Football, match of the day, it's much more interesting to watch clips. I'm going to be much more engaged than if there's a table or a chart. And I say that as someone who makes a lot of tables and charts for a living. So there is that. I think one of the things I've noticed as well in other sports is you take so the England cricket team got in a little bit of trouble recently. Not trouble, but there was a few questions raised when they were playing a T20 in South Africa, and they were getting hit all over the park. And actually, the England data scientist, Nathan Lehman, was putting these, I think it was like numbers and letters on the balcony wall. So it was like 42E or something like that. And it was being used by Owen Morgan, the captain, to it was obviously some kind of code in order to adjust the field or adjust the bowling or whatever it was. And there's a question as to, are you able to do that? And within the rules, they were perfectly able to do it. That may change over time in terms of the kind of coaching influence, as we see in tennis, for example. It's not that. But I think that might be a direction that potentially football goes down as well, because you've got the coaches barking orders from the touchline. It's very hard to kind of communicate with players on the far side of the pitch in a full stadium. Very hard to get messages across during 45 minutes, and obviously games can shift quite rapidly within the course of a half. So I think that might be a direction that we might see things go in, where that there's kind of signaling and codes that players pick up on, and they've not learned to like a quarterback, but I think they might be a bit more, players are so much more tactically aware now than I think they were 15 years ago. I think that might be a trend we see.
Just two very brief things as well that, when speaking to the data performance and stats clients that we work with a lot, is, as most people have seen, especially in the Premier League, but obviously on other lower leagues as well, is that the management team now have access to live stats effectively throughout the game. And in order, I guess, to be able to understand intensity, running stats, fatigue, all the different load factors, etc., that otherwise might be. But then also the other thing that seems to be happening a lot more, and it was instructive that Klopp was saying this in an interview a while back, was that he was asked, why does he run to the dressing room, especially at Anfield, right away at half time? And supposedly it's because is that Liverpool put 2 or 3 visual clips up at half time to be able to demonstrate the tactical tweaks that are necessary during that break. So rather than telling, they're showing. And again, it might be something that, is in your broader team, but are those types of, quite small micro changes obviously be quite useful from going from what Bielsa is saying to the actual tech advances that can assist players and coaches?
Yeah, it was almost, the Bielsa presentation was almost treated as like, this is amazing, this is incredible. Actually, from a kind of player communication, and I'm sure this isn't the case, this isn't the way that it's communicated to players, but from a player communication point of view, not good at all, really, because no one's going to be able to digest that level of information. Is a kind of massive part of it, and I think it's interesting. You know, 15 minutes is not a long time, but half times used to be 10 minutes, and they got changed probably in the early 90s, I think, with some of the kind of modernizations around the game. And in 15 minutes, you know, you've got a lot to get across, and clubs now will have, during games, analysts sitting in the stands coding particular events. So yes, they're getting the live data from data providers, but often they'll be coding their own events, and there'll be very specific things. So it might be, I don't know, the number of times the goalkeeper plays to the fullback and the fullback plays it long, because maybe that's a thing that the club's trying to do in that particular game, or they're trying to stop the opposition doing. And so being able to coding that gives you two things. So firstly, it gives you data points. It tells you like how many times that's been done by which players, but it also gives you access to clips, because you can literally go down the software and go, give me all the 5 times that's happened, get up on the TV screen in the dressing room, and be able to kind of communicate it to the players. So you got the kind of stat aspect, and you got the video aspect. So yeah, I've never been in a dressing room at halftime. I can't imagine what it's like. Obviously, seeing clips in the various documentaries that have been aired, but my understanding, it can be quite a chaotic place. But the level of technology available to clubs now means that they can influence games in a way that previously would have just been a head coach with the hairdryer treatment.
I was just thinking, and it might be just a topic for another conversation today, because I really like all of you when you always think about a lot of blue sky thinking ideas. It just got me thinking about, at what point do halftime breaks go longer than 15 minutes? At some point, you know, obviously with the level of aerobic ability that obviously people are running faster, sprinting more, covering more ground, etc., would 5 minutes more recovery time be of real value to teams generally, to be able to have a better second half performance level? That's
a really interesting point, actually. I'd never even considered it, but it's an interesting thing, that what happens if we change this thing. And even this season, it might have been a consideration, particularly given, you know, all the injuries that we've seen this season. I'm actually amazed it's not come up before, but it's certainly, it's a good thread to pull on that. I'd like to do that another time for sure.
Let's think about that. So just before we go, Omar, I don't, you know, it sounds terrible to say, what's the other Champions League game tonight? I haven't yet actually.
And it's Bayern Lazio, which
that'd be
I don't know who it was on Twitter, but remarked it feels like a very mid-nought or early noughties second group stage kind of game, and I can picture those early noughties kits of Lazio and Bayern Munich too. I think two really good games tonight. I love the Champions League knockout stages.
No, this is going to be really good, and I think I know. And also just on the Chelsea Atleti one, it's just fascinating, and maybe we can talk about another time, the resurgence of Suarez.
Yes.
You know, I'm sure you've got some really interesting stats on him, and obviously linking up with Felix as well, who is obviously on fire right now after massive transfer from Benfica, was it a while back?
Yeah.
But, you know, Suarez is on absolute fire right now by the sounds of it. And that's not bad for a pretty, you know, an older striker now, who's usually, you'd expect by his age, is he 34?
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things, I think, going on with player age curves at the moment that is certainly worth the discussion.
Well, before we go, what do you think on first leg scores for tonight?
Yeah, so I get to go first this time. Bayern, and I think Atletico. I think that I know they had a hiccup on the weekend, but they're looking like, I've actually got a little bit of money on Atletico to win the Champions League this year. I think they're a good value bet.
Interesting. Well, I don't have too much choice then, do I really? So we'll catch in again in a week or so's time. And just before we go, just a quick reminder on the football aid front for those of you guys in the UK, if you like donating some money to a really good charity. It's Football Aid, and you can text 785 70085 and text the words footy, FOOTY. Thanks for listening in and watching in. As always, Omar, great to have you on. I say on, great to have your input as usual. It's great to have me on, I guess.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah. And on that note, thanks. Yeah, and look forward to seeing everybody next week.
I'll catch you next week. Cheers, Dan.